Hello, guys, and welcome back, or 2,000 subscribers. Yes, we've hit 2,000 subscribers. Welcome back. We're going to be talking about the Imola Grand Prix. It's going to be my first ever Grand Prix review, so bear with me. We're changing up the format of some certain things on this channel. But before we get into any sort of, race talk or anything like that, I just want to start off with two things. First of all, Crofty was missing this weekend. I don't know why Crofty was missing this weekend, but he was sorely missed. Personally, I think the best duo is Martin alongside Crofty because Martin almost gives off that old head that knows exactly what he's talking about. Generally, he does, and he's a lot more chill than Crofty, so it really does balance it out. More than that, he is an ex F1 driver, which, you know, it's kind of weird that we don't have more ex F1 drivers, especially F1 champions, working in Formula One. I think that has something to say about the way Formula One treats their drivers and treats management in the sport. But if you look at football, for example, you got Jamie Carragher, you got Gary Neville. If you look at Monday Night Football, you look at any sort of football show, you got Thierry Henry. They have ex footballers, not only ex footballers, ex legends of the sport commentating and giving their insight. And I think that we're lacking that a lot in F1. So it's really nice when Martin is there. So Martin and Crofty hopefully will be back in Monaco. But moving on to the track, Imola has had some good changes this year. They've moved some of the gravel traps close to the track so there isn't as much runoff areas. And it has been catching a lot of people off, which is good. We like it when Formula One, intentionally or even unintentionally listens to the fans. That being said, Imola definitely has some problems. And one of the problems is that you just can't overtake there. Most of the overtakes from this race, if you were really watching, came from Perez because everyone was going past Perez because he had 25 lap old tires. When there was a driver that didn't have 25 lap old tires or not a crazy tire advantage or a crazy delta advantage, it really was really difficult to overtake. Leclerc got really close inside DRS, inside like half a second of Norris, but he couldn't overtake. And so I think the track has some problems that either need to be ironed out or, dare I say, just remove Imola from the calendar, which I think isn't a controversial statement, but is probably a controversial statement because F1 fans are very double minded in the sense that we want things to move forward. We want better cars. We want technology to move forward in F1, but we aren't willing to do things that are going to accommodate those changes. Everyone wants Formula One to get faster, to get bigger, to get better as a sport, but you can't have fast cars going around Monaco. It just doesn't work. If you want cars to go around Monaco, they're going to have to be small, they're going to have to be light, and they're probably not going to be as quick. And I don't see any problem in updating Imola to make it more F1 accommodating. We've had changes to tracks like Abu Dhabi, but if you really want to keep tracks like Imola on the calendar and them not become bore fest where the fans start to resent the circuit, you're gonna have to make changes. And I think making changes isn't gonna ruin the fundamental characteristics of the fact that it is Imola. But if you don't want to make changes, it's fine. You can take it off the calendar. See, I have mixed feelings about qualifying because although it's always great to have someone different sitting on pole, it starts to get a little bit hard to get excited for qualifying when I know that as long as Max qualifies within the top three, he's probably going to be able to overtake and still win the race. So it almost seems inconsequential who qualifies on pole. Probably the whole, Charles qualifying on pole and never converting that to a win has desensitized me to the importance of a pole position and how easily it can be lost. But this week's qualifying was pretty good. I would say that it had some shockers. Obviously, you don't anticipate Fernando Alonso to not do well in qualifying. Him qualifying at the back of the grid, he was taking Logan Sargent's position, but that was probably because of the mistake he made in FP3. They did bring upgrades, and it seems like those upgrades, well, I wouldn't say it didn't work. It didn't work on a net scale compared to what everyone else was bringing. Mercedes brought the second half of their upgrades. Red Bull and Ferrari both brought upgrades. And obviously McLaren had that massive upgrade package from last weekend. And I've always said this with upgrades, but I'll say it again for those of you who probably haven't seen that video. Upgrades are probably the most useless thing to base whether a team is going to move forward or backwards, simply because upgrades don't guarantee pace. what guarantees pace is understanding your car and applying that knowledge to your car. If I had to ask you what would give more performance, a team knowing exactly what setup window they need for their car to be in the right place and the right balance for the driver, or giving two upgrades in which they have to spend two practice sessions, essentially understanding what it does. If you had to give me the choice, I would firmly choose the team knowing exactly or learning the exact set window for the car they already have. Just because an upgrade looks big doesn't mean it has a big impact. Red Bull had a massive upgrade, I think it was in Miami, and they literally lost that race. So, it's not always what it chalks up to be. But another big shocker, Perez struggling, gets out in Q2, gets knocked out by Daniel Ricciardo. I did say about Daniel Ricciardo, he is definitely finding his feet. Daniel Ricciardo is definitely finding his feet. He's not as bad as the season openers, but at the same time, he just isn't as good as Sonoda. I think we've seen some great Daniel performances in Miami, and I think it's fair to say that Sonoda still has the edge on him, especially with that blistering lap that put him, I think it was P4 in Q2, and in the end, I think he settled for like a P8 or P9. I know he sandwiched in between the Mercedes, so it was good on him. Ended up getting points as well. All round, just another stellar weekend for Yuki Tsunoda. In fact, Yuki Tsunoda is actually pretty close to overtaking Lance Stroll in points, in case you didn't know. And personally speaking, Yuki Tsunoda is one of my favorite drivers on the grid, and I'm going to be really sad to see if he does go. I do anticipate he has about one more year left in 2025 on his Red Bull contract, depending on how Daniel does. And I really do mean depending on how Daniel does, because you just know that no matter how much he beats Daniel, I think if Daniel gets around three good performances, Red Bull will, or at least Christian Horner will parade them like, look, the old Daniel is back. The same way that he did one good lap and that was good enough to justify 2 or 3 years of inadequate driving. Red Bull will really take anything they can get with Daniel Ricciardo because, to be honest, there isn't really much worse than Perez. Perez is just about good enough to allow him to be there when the car is dominant. But when the car isn't dominant, it's kind of a bit too late to replace him. And it's kind of starting to become the same thing with Daniel, where when the car is in a great place and Yuki is showing that Daniel is putting in okay performances, but I just don't trust Daniel to be beating Yuki over a season, and I still don't think he is going to beat Yuki over a season. Other than that, Piastri got a penalty, but he did qualify on the second row of the grid. Max Verstappen pole, good pole. Now, the race was mixed. Everyone started on mediums except for Perez, which was a strategical strong point, in my opinion. That was a good choice. Had it been on any other track but Imola, because when you start on the alternate strategy, for those of you who don't know, it's not just about going long because that won't help you. What you need to do is that you need to catch to the back of, let's say, the leading pack. So you need to get behind like a Lewis who is in like P8, and you need to catch him and use that free air whilst you have tires. And then when you pit back again, hopefully that pace would have allowed you to come out in front of the back markers or who you shouldn't have been behind in the first place. And from there, with your fresher tires, you can use that free air to then chase onto Lewis. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Where the strategies don't work is if you're on hard tires and the people who are ahead of you who shouldn't be ahead of you are on medium tires, and you're on a track like Imola and you're Perez, and so you can't overtake because their tires are mostly better than yours throughout your stint or throughout their stint, and because they're slower than the Lewis's, a massive gap opens up. Now, in hindsight, Perez would have probably got past George, and maybe Lewis as well, had he been on the medium tire. Considering how early the AlphaTauris went into the pits, obviously they wouldn't have known that before the race started, but just as a word of thumb, I think it would have been probably better to start on the mediums because the pace just wasn't there, or at least the track didn't accommodate overtaking. So by the time Perez did get in free air, he almost had to do it all over again at the end of the race, which I guess yielded okay results, but it really was subpar from a car that is winning the race in the hands of Max Verstappen. Overall, for those of you who, again, may not know, or maybe you are new to Formula One, the whole doing the alternate strategy basically only works if you have pace. If you have the Formula One game, you can test this one out. When you try and do the alternate strategy, don't make as many overtakes and still use the alternate strategy. You will be able to, you will use the pace and you will be able to make some overtakes when you get the better tire later on. But at the same time, it does mean that you basically kind of go nowhere because whilst you have that free air, you just get undercut by the people who have better tires than you. What you really need is to actually make overtakes whilst you have the tire that is disadvantageous to you. So if your opponents are on the medium tire and you're on the hard tire, then you need to make overtakes on them whilst they still have the better tires on you. That's why, generally speaking, teams will only go for the alternate strategy when they're out of position because they're required to still make overtakes for the strategy to work, and they can maybe make those overtakes on cars that are slower than them, hence them being out of position. So Perez didn't do that, and it kind of compromised his race, but I'm not going to fault him for it as much because there just wasn't that much overtaking in general on track. And it's a massive shame because this was a Grand Prix that I think could have benefited a lot from a track that accommodates overtaking. Imagine it. Perez would have been able to get into the fight with the Mercedes, even the Mercedes that was stuck in no man's land. Lewis was about a second behind George for most of the race. And maybe if the track was more accommodating towards overtakes, a Merc battle might have been able to take place. Maybe not, but a little bit of a battle, at least in the first stint, would have been able to take place. Between the Ferraris, I think it would have still been calm, but I think Piastri would have definitely given Sainz more of a bother, and Leclerc would have definitely been able to get past Norris when he was half a second behind for about 4 or 5 laps, but just couldn't overtake because you do need a massive delta to overtake. Most of the overtakes were done on Perez whilst he had 25-lap older tyres than the car, which is, Leclerc or Hamilton or Russell. It was all of them breezing past Perez whilst he was getting cooked. All of the components for the Grand Prix were there, including slightly surprising bad strategy by Ferrari. Everyone knows that the Ferrari means, bad strategy. But at the same time, I genuinely believe that Ferrari has been on an upturn. They've put in a better car this year than they did last year. And they've been more consistent with pit stops and strategies until this race, in which they decided to leave both their cars out and let the McLarens pit. And whilst they did that, I went, okay, so Norris is getting to the back of Perez. If Norris overtakes Perez quickly within the lap, you need to pit both your cars. And he did do that. He did overtake myself. I was like, okay, they're going to pit their cars now because clearly the traffic that was holding Norris is not going to hold him for very long or hasn't held him at all. And Piastri is coming through very quickly as well. They didn't do that. In fact, they waited like 2 laps. And by the time they decided to pit, not Crofty, Karoon was saying that, maybe they've trying to pit for the overcut. That's not why they pitted Karoon. The reason they pitted was because Piastri was going to overtake Leclerc. And he'd already got Sainz. They were already too late for that party. And he was about to overtake Leclerc as well. If you actually watch, Leclerc and Piastri come out. Well, when Leclerc comes out, he's actually really close to Piastri. So much so that he is in DRS range. I think the only thing that gives Leclerc some breathing space is he overtakes Perez, which gives him a car's gap between him and Piastri. So there was a lot of good ingredients for this Grand Prix. McLaren's and Ferrari's fighting at the end, Norris charging for the lead, Red Bull not as dominant as usual. If the track could accommodate overtakes, Alonso could be coming up the field, Perez could be coming up the field. Many things this Grand Prix that, generally speaking, should have lended to a very interesting Grand Prix, but it was very much hampered by the fact that this track is just not suitable for F1. And I know it's very hard to say that because obviously it's Imola and we love it because Senna died here. But well, it just isn't. This isn't a track that you would expect amazing racing from. Ironically enough, though, we are going to a track that is probably the quintessential, why is this on the calendar? And I do believe that if Imola was a new track introduced in today's day and age, it wouldn't survive 3, 4, 5 seasons, unless they were putting in Middle East type of money, simply because F1 fans would hate it. But because F1 fans seem to love old things so much, well, we're stuck with Imola. I'm going to give this race a solid 5 out of 10. A lot of potential, didn't deliver, wasn't the driver's fault. Everyone looked very racy, and yeah, could have been a lot better.